Hi everyone, and welcome to Moxxie Life Coaching. I'm Michele, and I'll be your host as we explore what life coaching is and how it can empower you to create and live your best life. We'll talk about topics ranging from our own self-defeating behaviors to getting to know our authentic selves. Together, we'll investigate a variety of self-coaching modalities and explore a wide range of topics relevant to getting the most out of the life that you are actively creating. New episodes will drop every Tuesday, so please subscribe so you don't miss out on the great hints, tips, and tricks, and generally awesome content that will help you create your best life. So welcome, and thank you for listening. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining me for another episode of the Moxxie Coaching podcast. This week, we're going to talk about something that is near and dear to my heart, and I suspect something that all of us have experienced on one level or another, or at one point or another, and that is failure and the fear of failure, and how that fear of failure can impact our ability or our willingness, even sometimes, to put ourselves out there and move forward with our lives. I'm what you might call a recovering grade A self-critic. I have had to learn how to reframe the concept of failure essentially in order to keep my life moving forward. So here's my story, my sad little story. In 5th grade, I got my first ever C on an assignment, and I sobbed. I had never in my academic career, my illustrious academic career in kindergarten through 4th grade, ever received a C. And this ditto, that'll tell you how old I am, in 5th grade on the metric system, I will remember until the day I die. It had little penguins on it, and it had a big giant C with a bunch of, red X's because of all the answers that I had marked incorrectly. And I was so upset. I mean, like really upset. I saw that C as a massive failure. And that's interesting because I don't recall, anyway, having a lot of academic pressure put on me. I simply was maybe just a general pleaser type of kid. And when you're a pleaser, you want to do a good job because then you get strokes for being a good kid. It's the only thing I can think of. But either way, here I am standing in our little family room, frantically waving this ditto in front of my mom, just sobbing. And she's looking at me like, wow, okay. And she proceeded to, of course, let me know that, gosh, she still loved me even though I got a C on my ditto. And that I should probably prepare to receive more C's as I went on in my academic career, because that's just how it was. Honestly, I don't remember the outcome of that situation. I don't remember anything beyond just that moment. But the fact that I remember it this many years later tells me that it was an impactful event for me as a child. So I took a break from obsessing about being perfect and my grades and all of those types of things. In my senior year, I was way more interested in my new boyfriend and in having fun my senior year. And for whatever reason, I was able to put aside that little goody two shoes academic um, praise seeker. And of course, my grades dropped, but I didn't give a rip at that point. But by college, I was back on the bandwagon. So my little, my experiment in not giving a rip didn't last very long. Um, Back in college, I was back into my old patterns again. Really caring about my grades. I can't remember exactly what I graduated with, but it was close to a 4 point, so I was pretty happy with that. But that type of pressure that I put on myself was utterly ridiculous. And there was so much of my self-worth that was tied up in doing well in school, in achieving, and in not failing anything, in not failing a class, in not failing a paper, in not failing, an answer if I raised my hand. I wasn't the person who would raise my hand and hope that it was correct or the answer that I was going to provide was correct. I would raise my hand if I knew darn tootin' well that that answer was correct, because I didn't want to embarrass myself and I didn't want to fail in front of the students in class. So much of my self-worth was tied into doing well and succeeding and not failing. I realized many years later that I ended up making choices that failed to challenge me. I ended up making choices that failed to promote growth. I made choices that were safe, and those safe choices kept me successful in the small things that I chose to do, but they kept me small. They kept me in a confined, limited place. You're only able to accomplish what you're willing to screw up, I guess, if that makes any sense. You have to be willing to put yourself out there. You have to be willing to fail in order to achieve something. And that's something that I really hesitated to do. And it was something that basically informed my career choices for the next number of years. For example, rather than fail at adulting because I was terrified to be on my own and support myself 100% and get the big girl job and do all of those things, I went so far as to accept a wedding proposal just before I graduated college because I was afraid of failing at being a full-on adult. And that was a massive mistake because I hugely underestimated my own worth. I underestimated my own abilities. And that decision impacted my life for the next 15 years. My marriage was not a good one much of the time. Um, I knew fairly quickly after I said I do that I should have said no thank you. Yet I stayed married for 12 or 13 years because I did not want to admit to myself or to anyone else that I had failed, that I had made a mistake, that I wasn't able to be in this marriage with this person. Especially after very quietly, very gently, very subtly, a number of people had said, "Hey, are you sure you want to be doing this?" Yep, 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 yep. I'm sure this is what I want to do. And that's what I did. And I paid for that decision. Thankfully, my quote unquote professional career at that point went better than my marriage. And I was a lot more successful as a teacher and as an administrator than I was as a wife. My professional confidence really grew through that time period, and um, through various workplace successes, through establishing great relationships with peers and great relationships with my employers, to the point where employers were sorry to see me go, um, really helped me ditch that story about myself that I had a tendency to be a quote failure if I didn't do things exactly perfectly and exactly right all the time and every time. Since it was important for me to make a contribution through my work, I typically dove pretty deeply into whatever it was that I was doing. I was emotionally involved in pretty much any job I ever had as an adult, certainly not including the cashier at the hardware store when I was in high school or that type of thing. But as an adult, my jobs have been, what do I want to say? My jobs have been heartfelt. And I think that I gauged my self-worth in large part on what I did for a living and what I was able to accomplish in that setting. I had a tendency to forget about all of the other things that I did in my life and all of the other successes that I had and all of the other times that I had not failed. But I think that I'm telling you this, I guess, because I think that my story is not so different from so many other people's story. I cannot be the only one who has made choices based on fear of failure. Years later, a business I had heavily invested in on an emotional level, on a social level, from the perspective of how much time and effort I put into it, just the psychic energy that I was putting into this job, um, was pretty immense. And that business collapsed through absolutely no fault of my own. And yet, that collapse really impacted me and my self-worth and my idea of myself as a success or as a failure. After that business closed down, I really, really struggled to recognize and internalize that I was still the same person. I was still the same person that had the same drive and the same passion, the same intellect, all of the same things. Nothing had changed in me when that business went under. The only thing had changed was that I was no longer working for the same company because they made some really poor decisions. Now, because of my position in that company, I was third in the company after the two owners, if you looked at the org chart. And I felt a great deal of responsibility for that business, especially for the people who lost their jobs because of that situation. I had regularly shared my thoughts with everyone. I had regularly um, pounded the table and said, no, this is not the right direction to be going right now. This is not the way to be spending the money that we have to spend right now. This went on for probably 6 or 8 months. And eventually, the poor decisions that were made forced the closure of the business. And it really took me a long time, to realize that the business failed. I didn't fail. But that feeling of failure really stuck around long enough to seriously impact my confidence when it came to finding new jobs. And so much so that I think I mentioned this in a different podcast, but I took a job because I was afraid of failing. I had to have something, right? You can't just not work. And I knew I shouldn't have taken that job. If somebody had smashed me over the head with a 2x4, I couldn't have known it anymore, but I took the job anyway because I was afraid of being seen as a failure for not having a job, 2 months after this other business had closed or whatever. So it really took me a very long time to finally come around to the fact that the business had failed, that I hadn't failed. Now, fast forward to the fairly recent past when a nonprofit I worked for basically suffered the same fate. My input, my concerns, my feedback were consistently ignored. And lo and behold, they closed down too. And there were some incredibly poor decisions made. And in this particular situation, I was second on the org chart and supposedly someone who was a quote unquote equal in this business endeavor. Yet my male counterpart really, really struggled to hear what I had to say and to listen and implement. We talked and we talked probably, goodness, for close to 6 months. Conversations in which I would share my concepts of what we should be doing, which direction we should be going, and they went unheeded. So no point in getting into all of that. The whole point in this, bringing this up with this second business that went the same way, is that I did not let it affect me the same way the second time around. The second time around, I picked myself up and I walked away before things collapsed. And I truly, to this day, wish things had been different. But I am still 100% confident that I have done everything I could do, that I had put all of the emotional and psychic and intellectual energy into this project that I could. And it was very, very difficult to walk away. And yet I did. And it changed the way I perceive myself, and it changed the way I perceive failure. Now, let's be perfectly clear. That was one instance. And there were plenty, plenty, plenty of other times when I have felt like a failure, when we all have felt like a failure. But in general, I have learned to look at my screw ups through the lens of what I learned and how I could use that knowledge moving forward than through the lens of I failed. And my philosophy is, as long as I don't repeat the same difficult lesson twice, I consider that a success. Failure, learning, implementing the learning, moving on. Using that failure as a catalyst for growth. So these are some of the things that I've learned in general about failure over the years, living in my in my head, living as me. This is what I've learned. I have learned that failure that is truly due to someone else's decision is not failure. Failure due to our own decision is failure. Yep, screwed up, failed, boo hiss on me, right? But each of those failures has the potential to bring an opportunity, to bring a lesson, and to provide us with valuable experience that hopefully we use as we move forward in our lives. These three things, opportunity, lesson, and experience, can help us reframe or recontextualize failure. When we live through a failure, we gain valuable experience, experience that could not have been gained any other way. And a lot of times those lessons that we learn or those experience points that we gain from falling on our face are extremely valuable in a variety of ways. Even though there are areas in which I have failed, the experiences that I have gained because of those failures have been extremely valuable. Those experiences have given me more of a sense of myself. They've given me more of a sense of often what I want to do, how I want to move forward in a situation, or how I want to sit with something and figure it out for a little while before I move forward without having thought about it. Basically, meaning sometimes those experiences have made me more thoughtful. I gained an incredible amount of experience working for these companies that closed down. And the lessons. What about the lessons that we all learn through the failures that we have? When living through something that we consider a failure, we are gaining valuable experience and we're gaining, hopefully, valuable knowledge. Number one, we learned that failure isn't fatal. Everyone fails on occasion. At least everyone who tries fails on occasion. If we're never willing to put ourselves out there, if we're never willing to take a chance, then we're not going to fail, but we're going to be living a very small life. I would also say that if we don't fail on occasion, we're maybe not trying. If we don't fail, maybe we're not stretching ourselves enough. Because with each stretch, there is the potential for failure, but with each stretch, there's also the learning that comes with that and the experience that comes with that that can be used in the future. Ideally, ideally we learn from those lessons, right? Ideally, we take that information and we alter our behavior or we alter whatever's necessary to be altered so we don't fail again in that particular situation. I've also learned a lot about what works in particular situations and what doesn't work in particular situations through successes and through failures. And one of the most interesting things I've learned, and I would hope that others have learned this as well. Maybe you all know this and I am just a late bloomer, but I learned that other people often, very often, see us differently from the way we see ourselves. And often the way others see us is through a more gentle lens than we have a tendency to see ourselves. I had a conversation with an old friend of mine, someone with whom I had not been in contact for quite a long time. And during that conversation, she said to me, "Oh my gosh, I've always just seen you as such a go-getter. I've always seen you as someone just motivated to, change the world or motivated to do X, Y, and Z." And that really floored me because her concept of me was different from my concept of me. I never looked at myself as a real hardcore go-getter. So it was interesting to me to see or to hear her perspective. And it was a really, really good lesson in not worrying about what other people think and having that be the biggest reason we fear failure. For me personally, I have felt a fear of failure because my concern was always what would other people think of me if I was a failure. It was not nearly as much about what would I think of myself. And that's been a real eye-opener. I've also learned that we should be grateful for those failures. And at the time, yeah, it's difficult, right? It's hard to say when you're in the throes of woe, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe how grateful I am for this experience where I just fell flat on my face." No, it takes a while. You're human. We're human. It just does. But there's eventually, hopefully, will be some gratitude that shows up for what you learned, how it changed you as a person, hopefully for the better. And how it can be used to inform your decisions in the future. The right amount of failure can also instill some resilience in us. And when I say the right amount of failure, I think that's a pretty subjective statement. But what I'm getting at, I think, is if you have never failed, the first time you do, it's going to blow your socks off. One of the unpopular things about me as a preschool teacher was that I was not an advocate for everyone getting an award or everyone getting recognized for this, that, or the other thing, because in my mind that instills an early sense of entitlement and an early sense of feeling that regardless of what one does, one's going to be patted on the back for it. And that's just not how life works. So when I say the right amount of failure, that's what I'm getting at. Certainly being crushed repeatedly is going to impact you negatively being crushed repeatedly is likely to greatly impact your willingness to try for the 25th time. But an appropriate amount of failure or an appropriate amount of not being perfect is, I think, a gift in that it teaches us that it's okay to not be perfect. It teaches us that it's okay not to be the winner every single time. Failures also provide us opportunities because so often when we experience some sort of failure, there's a shift in our lives. And that shift, we may discover later, was actually a shift for the better. I know that I have found a much more fitting work situation for myself than the situation I had with the companies that failed. I have created and cultivated and nurtured a new relationship and have been happily married for 10 years now. And I never would have had that opportunity had I not failed in my first marriage or had my first marriage not failed. Lastly, I really truly believe that each failure that we have, that we examine and look at with an open heart and with honest eyes, makes the next go around more likely to be successful. As long as we are taking lessons from our failures, I would invite you to look at each of your quote unquote failures as simply just another lesson in life that is moving you toward your ultimate goal. And now that you've learned that lesson, you can approach the challenge, or you can approach the relationship, or you can approach the job, or you can approach whatever the situation might be from the perspective of someone who is informed and thoughtful and bringing past experience to this new experience. So I hope this podcast has helped you be a little bit easier on yourself, and I hope it has helped you recontextualize some of the things that you may have looked at throughout your life as a failure, because we all have them, and the best we can do is learn from them and move forward. So that's my 2 cents for today. I hope that you have a fantastic rest of the week. And please do me a favor and like, subscribe, rate, review, do all of those things on whatever platform you are listening today. I would greatly appreciate it. And I will look forward to talking to you again next week. Thank you so much and be well.